This is Mikey Borup for PremiumBeat.com, and in this After Effects course, you will learn the basics to advanced features of After Effects: interface, shape layers, motion tracking, compositing, and more. During these tutorials, feel free to pause, rewind, and ask questions. I will be using After Effects CC version 12.2, but most of the techniques learned can be used in older versions. In this video, we will cover interface, effects, solids and layers, creating your first animation, and rendering. So let's fire up After Effects and get started. Okay, so here I am in After Effects, and when you first open it up, this is what it looks like. So let me take you a little tour through the interface and kind of how things are. And so when you get here, you're not going to be too confused. So first off, I want to show you that you can change the way that the interface looks. So this is just the standard, but if I come into Window up here at the top, Workspace, there's all of these different ways to set up all the panels. I prefer standard, that's what I usually use, but you might like animation, effects. See, all these panels are moving in different directions and moving different places. Here's a minimal version, one just for motion tracking. So what it does is it brings up different panels based on what you're doing. Let me go back to standard. You can also create your own workspace. So say I move everything around differently. See, I can just grab this edge and move things around. And say maybe I want this character. I can bring that off and I can move these panels to different spots. I can come to Window, Workspace, and click on New Workspace, and it will create that workspace. I can save it as whatever name I want. Now say I mess up this workspace as standard, well, I can come down here to where it says Reset Standard. Yes, and it goes back to the way that they had it. Also, I can come up here and just switch things from this panel right there where it says Workspace Standard. That's another way of doing that. Something you'll learn in After Effects is there's always more than one way of doing anything, whether it's an effect or moving things around. There seems to be multiple ways of doing different things, and it just depends on what your project is and what your needs are. Depends on what you choose. So just take that into consideration as you're learning After Effects, that there's always more than one way of doing everything. So let's take a look at this standard workspace. This first window is the project window. This is where all of your compositions will be. This is where all of your solid layers and any footage you have. And I can simply drag and drop footage or images or pictures or video files right into this project window, and it'll bring it in here. This is just a screenshot from a previous video of mine, and I can just drag it from my desktop, drop it right into After Effects. Now down here at the bottom, there's some different buttons. So for instance, this button right here that looks like a folder, I can click on that and it creates a new folder. I can call this footage bin, and I can drop footage into here and keep things organized. This right here that looks like a little film frame, well, that's creating a new composition. And there's two ways of creating new compositions. I can click on this, and it brings up the composition settings, give it a name, give it my dimensions. I prefer, we can do some presets here. There's all sorts of presets of what you want your dimensions of your composition to be, or you can just put them in by hand. So 1280 by 720, give it a frame rate, change the pixels. So everything that you're used to as far as creating a new composition or a new sequence, if you're used to Premiere or other video editing programs, same things here. What's different in After Effects than any other program is that you have to set your duration. In Premiere or Final Cut, the timeline, there's no fixed end to it. It just goes as long as you need. In this, there is a fixed end. So if I set this to 10 seconds, like I have here, 10 seconds and 11 frames, well, it's going to stop at 10 seconds and 11 frames. If I have a 30-second clip, it's not going to fit in there, and it's going to cut off the end of it. So to get around having to rechange my duration, there's another way you can do this. So it created that composition, and since I had this highlighted, this footage bin, it automatically stuck it into that bin. Now, if I don't want it in there, I can just drag it out, and it'll not be in there anymore. So what I want to do is I'm going to drag in a video file. This is just .mov. Let's put it in the footage bin. Now, This video file I can see here is 1 minute and 30 seconds and 19 frames. There's all the information up here. If I take this and drag it and drop it right on this frame down here, it'll automatically create a new composition right there, and it'll name it the same thing as my video file, and it'll automatically set the length, the duration of the composition to the duration of the clip. It'll automatically set the resolution to the same resolution of the clip, and so everything fits just fine. Now say you want to change the settings to a composition after you create it. Well, up here at the top says composition, and you can go composition settings. You can also see, if you look any of these menus up top, next to it will give you a keyboard shortcut. I'm on a Mac, so this is Command K to bring up your composition settings. And so then I can easily learn all these keyboard shortcuts because it's giving me them right here in the windows. Right there for a new composition, Command N, composition setting, Command K. Or I also like to, if I just right click next to the composition, it brings me up this composition settings. And it brings me back to this dialog box. I can change the name of it here, so I don't like the name of that composition. Tree footage. And it's always a good idea to have good names and keep yourself organized, because the bigger your projects get, the more complicated, more hard it is to stay organized. So try to do that from the beginning. And say I only want this to be a 30-second composition. So I can come in here, change the duration, click OK, and you can see it's now only 30 seconds. See, it says 30 seconds down there at the end. Let's kind of go forward with the tour of the interface. Next thing I want to show you is this composition window. This is your final output. This shows you what you're going to be seeing. This shows you what's down in the timeline. And there's some different things that you want to pay attention to. Right here it says 50%. I can set this to fit, and what it's going to do is now if my interface is a different size, it'll scale just to fit. Or I can have it smaller, 33, and then I can see around. You might have some big pieces of solid images or solid layers that kind of stick out of the frame. You want to be able to see where those are at, and so sometimes you need to zoom out. I can also just scroll on my scroll wheel to zoom in and out of the picture. Let's set that back to fit. Now over here, there's different grid and guidelines. So if you need title or action safe, you can turn those on here. This right here is to toggle mask and shape path visibility. I'm not going to be teaching you all about shapes and masks in this lesson. We will in a different lesson. But when you do, it creates kind of an outline on the video clip itself that might be in the way. And if you want to see it, how it looks when it's rendered, you can just turn that on and off. And I'll show you that in a later video. Now let's go down to this one right here where it says full. This is your resolution for your preview. Now I can bring this down to quarter, and you can see instantly that it's starting to look more pixelated versus this. So what this is going to do is when I preview this, it's going to be faster. If I have a very complicated animation, I might need to bring this down to quarter resolution so I can see it in a, it'll preview it faster. Next it says active camera, and there's different views I can do. Now I don't have this in 3D, so these aren't really going to do anything because everything's 2D. But just know if you have a 3D camera, then this will show you all sorts of different views, and we'll go over this when we talk about 3D and cameras. I can also change different views. And again, this is more for if you are working with 3D, because then I can have one view be of one camera, one view be of another. See right here, this is active camera, this is top, and so I can see all sorts of different angles of my 3D. But again, for 2D footage, that's not that important. Let's go to one last thing I want to show you down here, and again, just go through all these buttons. Just if you hover over them, it'll tell you what they are. But right here where it says fast previews, right now I have it set on adaptive resolution. You can also set it on off, fast draft, wireframe, which just shows you a wireframe instead of the footage. And so what these are is if you've got lots of things going on, you may need to drop this down to a draft or a wireframe in order to see how the movement is, not necessarily caring what the footage is, you just want to see how it moves. And what adaptive resolution is it'll lower the resolution depending on the movement. So sometimes it moves things around, it'll drop the resolution, and then it'll bring it back up to full resolution. And sometimes that's hard to see. Sometimes it doesn't matter because it renders things faster. So it's a case-by-case basis on what you want. I usually leave it on adaptive resolution. Sometimes I just turn it off. Now before we go on down to the timeline, let's look at some of these windows over here on the right. Up here is the info window and the audio window. Now this is just, again, in the standard workspace. So if you're using a different workspace, things might be laid out a little differently. In the info, you can see as I hover my mouse over the footage, it's changing the RGB values, it's changing my X and Y values, and it's changing the alpha values. So I can just kind of hover over here and I can see, okay, that's the RGB, that's the X and Y. So it's a good way of getting some quick info. This preview, this is for RAM previews. And RAM previews is like rendering out your footage within After Effects so you can see it in full resolution and full speed, but you don't have to render it out and save it to a movie file. And while I'm doing RAM previews, I can actually change the resolution. This is different than changing the resolution over here. This is changing the resolution for a RAM preview. And after we do some animations, I'm going to show you exactly what that means. Okay, down here it says Effects and Presets. So all of my effects are down here that I would want to ever use on my footage. I can browse and find them here. I can also search for them here. So for instance, CC Light Sweep, I just started typing Light Sweep and it popped up here. Another thing you could do to find effects instead of search here, if you don't like this panel here, is up at the top you have all the effects. So I can find them here. I can even search in the help menu. So I can search Light Sweep and I hover over that and it'll show me right where it's at. I can see it's in Effects, it's in Generate, and then it's Light Sweep. So I can come down to Effects, Generate, Light Sweep. And then I can find it this way. So there's two ways, again, of finding effects. Now let's go down to the timeline. This is where you're going to be doing all of your animations, all of your compositions, and putting everything together. You're going to find as you get more and more into After Effects, this timeline you're going to need to have bigger and bigger because it's going to have lots and lots and lots and lots of layers. After Effects timelines are notorious for being very tall with lots and lots of layers. The thing about After Effects that's different than a normal video editing program is I can't just cut this footage right here and have one piece of footage right here and then another piece of footage in the same layer. Every separate piece of footage is in its own layer. For example, if I want to have maybe this point up to here, and I'm going to cut this, and then I can't put another piece of footage right there. It sticks it in a different layer. You just can't have two different pieces of footage in the same layer. So that's why things get rather tall, because everything, no matter how big or small it is its own layer. And there are ways of kind of getting around that. You can group things together, you can pre-compose things, and that's like nesting, but it still can get a little bit complicated. Let's take a look more into this timeline. So I have this layer down here, and it's just a footage, some snowy trees. This is actually a frozen river. People were walking across it. That's how cold it was. So I can come over here, and here are some more options. It says mode, and right now it's on normal. It says track matte, it says parent, it says source name. And then down at the bottom, this is an important one, it says toggle switches and modes. I can switch between two different sets of buttons in the timeline. I'm going to switch it over to switches. So this is the switches, this is the modes. Let's go back to switches. Here in the switches, you have some different checkboxes. So frame blending, motion blur, adjustment layers, and 3D. And then this is where you turn them on or off, is underneath them. So for instance, if I have motion blur, if I have something animated across, and we'll show this later on, I'd want to turn it on here, and I also need to turn it on right here globally for all of the layers. Another thing I can do is there's this little guy, he looks like he's hiding. If I click that on, and then click it here, then it'll hide that layer. So if you have lots of layers that you're not animating anymore, you're done with that part of the composition, and you just need them out of the way, well, you can click hide on all the layers, and you can hide them out of the way. Next to the footage, you'll see that there's a little triangle or a little twirl down menu. If I click that, I can see some of the attributes of this footage. So right now it says transform and audio. I don't have any effects applied to this footage yet, so I can't control them here because there's nothing there to control. But I can control the transform, which is your anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. So let's try anchor point. Anchor point right now is set to the very center of the footage. And it's kind of hard to see, but it's right there. There's a little tiny, kind of like a target. And what anchor point is that's where everything moves around. So the position follows the anchor point. The scale scales from the anchor point. The rotation rotates around the anchor point. For example, the anchor point is right in the center, and so that's where it's going to rotate. Now, if I were to move the anchor point to the side, now it's going to rotate around that point. There's another tool you can do to move the anchor point. And if I look up here at the top, there's more of these tools. And one of these is this one. It's called the pan behind tool. If I click on that, I can grab this anchor point and move it to wherever I want. And it'll keep the footage in the same spot. But again, I rotate, it'll rotate around that anchor point. If I scale, it'll scale up from that anchor point. And so that's the anchor point. I just hit Control Z or Command Z on the keyboard to undo, and it moved it back to the very center. Now, position, again, it's just where it's located. And position, I can just use this arrow tool up here. This is the selection tool, and I can move things around fairly easily. Once I click on the layer, you can see this bounding box. And this is going to alter the position. If I click on the bounding box and I can scale it down, that's going to alter the scale. And I held down Shift on the keyboard to make everything stay in proportion. If I don't hold down Shift, I can scale things like this. And then what I do is, you can see right here, the scale, the X and Y are different. That's why it's not proper. So sometimes you might need to scale it a little bit weird. Sometimes you want to keep it straight. So sometimes you might need to scale things like that where it's, taller or shorter. But most of the time, you just, especially with footage, you want to keep things proportional. So next, I'm going to take this tool up here. And if you haven't seen, there's all sorts of tools up here in the top left. And this is the rotate tool. Or if I hover over it, it says W. So I can hit W on the keyboard and it'll bring that up. And here I can rotate this way instead of using the values down here. But everything is reflected. Now say I do all sorts of stuff. I'm like, I don't like anything I just did. I can come down here to transform, and there's a button that says reset. And it sets it back to the way it was. So let's bring in a solid layer. Let's add a couple of effects, and let's create our first animation. So to create a new solid layer, I come up to Layer, New, Solid, or you can see Command Y or Control Y on a PC, and it brings up this solid settings. And I can make this any size. I can make it comp size, 1920 by 1080. Let's give it a name. Let's make it a red solid. And let's make it a square. So to make it a square, I just need to give it a square dimensions. So let's go 400 by 400. And now it's square. I can come down here, pick the color. We'll make it red. Click OK. And there's a red square right in the center. So let's add some effects to this. I'm not going to go through all of the effects, but I want to show you some things that you can do with this. And I encourage you to just go through your effects that you have in After Effects and see what they are. There's so many different effects and different things you can do here that until you just try them out, you can spend hours and hours and hours trying to teach them, but you really need to get in and just try most of them out. Let's go to blur. So in blur, let's do a Gaussian blur. And right now, it says blurriness set to 0 and blur dimensions. So I can blur this and it gets all blurry. Now I can also set this is horizontal and vertical, but if I switch it just to horizontal, it'll blur only in one direction, or vertical, only in one direction. So that's a Gaussian blur. Now, say I want to just show what this looks like on and off, well, it says FX right there, and I can turn this on and off. Now, along with turning on off the effect up here, I can do this down here in the timeline as well. So as I twirl down, see, and now I have effects. Because I've added an effect, this shows up down in the timeline. It says Gaussian blur, and right there it says effects. I can do the same thing here. I've got all of these controls down in the timeline. Let's do a keyframe and do a quick animation. I'm going to set this to horizontal and vertical, and let's keyframe the blurriness. So right next to where it says blurriness, there's a little stopwatch. I click that and it turns on the keyframes. And as I turn it on, it also shows down here, it shows your keyframe. That shows that I'm currently on the keyframe, that there's a yellow diamond in the center, and there's 2 arrows. So if I move out of the way, it's no longer highlighted yellow, but this arrow shows me I can move to that point. So I'm going to go forward. Let's go forward 2 seconds, and then let's bring the blurriness down to 0. And so now I've automatically created a second keyframe. So once you start the first keyframe, anytime you make a change, it'll make a second keyframe, assuming you're in a different part. If I were to make a change and I'm on top of this existing keyframe, it'll just change that keyframe. So for instance, right now, I can bring this up to almost 200, and it didn't create a new keyframe, it just edited that current keyframe. So you can see in my animation, let's go ahead and turn off this background layer. My animation, it's going blurry to sharp. And I just hit spacebar on the keyboard and it renders through that. And up here it's green, that means it's rendered through all of these frames and it can play it back in real time now. Now if I wanted to render this out, say I have lots of effects and it might take a long time. Now hitting spacebar is not going to guarantee that everything is going to play back in real time. So up here in this preview window, this is just the same as hitting play, pause. This is the same as hitting spacebar. But over here, see there's a triangle with lots of little lines. That's the RAM preview. And what this is going to do is it's going to stick everything into the RAM. Or I like to hit 0 on the keyboard. Now this is the 0 in the 10 keypad, and that's the same thing as RAM preview. I can hit that, that's the shortcut, and it does the RAM preview, and that way it'll be in real time. So that is our first animation. Pretty darn intense. Let's actually do a little bit more to this, because basically any attribute can be keyframed, and so therefore any attribute can be animated. Let's go into the transform. So let's have it start right here, and then we can go forward. See, I can also use these arrows to navigate to the next keyframe, and let's move it over here. Now, when I move that, it'll move anywhere, but if I hold down Shift on the keyboard, it'll lock it into place. So let's move it to right there. So now it's going to move, and it's going to change the blurriness at the same time. Let's do some more. Let's try some scale. Let's go to the next keyframe, and we can make it go bigger. So there's an animation. We can also, let's do rotation. Let's go to the next keyframe, and let's rotate it 90 degrees. And opacity. Let's change the opacity to 50%. So now as I play through this, you can see all those attributes are changing, and this is our first animation. So now that we have our animation, it's not too complex, it's not too amazing. Let's maybe change some things. So I don't like maybe where this is starting. So if I bring it back to the beginning, where my first keyframe is, I can do two things. I can change my position up here, or I can just grab my object and move it that way. Now if I didn't have my playhead at the beginning, say I had it right here, well, when I move it, it's going to move and create a new keyframe. And as you can see, I've got these little curve handles. So maybe I want it to curve like that, and I can grab these curve handles and I can make a really kind of cool line that it's following. Let's take a look at that. So now it's going to look like that as you animate. So also you'll notice I have this at 30 seconds and my animation is only 2 seconds. So I want to come into the composition settings. So I just right click to the right of here or to the left of the window, or I can come up here to composition settings, or I can do Command K and it brings in the composition settings. And let's bring this to from 30 seconds to 2 seconds. Click OK. And now we have our animation. Now that I've got the animation, let's render this out. So to render it out, we need to open up the render queue window. So I'm going to come up to window and then it says render queue. Click on that and it brings up a new window down here next to your timeline. I'm going to just move this to the complete over to the left. Let's go back over to this footage and say this is all I want to render out. Now, since this is transparent, if I don't render it out with a transparency, this is all going to turn black. And maybe I want that. But I can see what that's going to look like by clicking on this layer right here, and it turns the transparency grid off and turns it to black. If I want it on white, then I'm going to need to bring in a new solid layer. And then that's what I want to do. So layer, new, solid. Let's make this comp size, and let's change it to white. Click OK. Now, when it brings it in, it threw it up on top, and I want it to be on bottom. Layer order matters in both down here in the timeline and if you've got effects. So I only have one effect on this, so there's no real layer order, but if I've got multiple effects, it's going to render out those effects in order. So the top one first, then the next one, then the next one. Same thing down here. It's going to show the top layer first, then that one, then that one. Since the top layer is completely covering everything, I can't see anything else. So I'm going to take this and bring it down to the bottom, and now I can see my animation. All right, so now that I've got this, I want to send this to the render queue so I can render it out. So I'll go to File, Export, Add to Render Queue. I can also add to Adobe Media Encoder, but that's a different program, and that works if you've got lots of compositions that you want to go out at a time. It can queue things up. It's really great that way. I'm going to just send this to the render queue so it's not going to a different program. Now that I'm in the render queue, you can see here it says tree footage. That was the name of the composition. Even though I disabled the tree footage, it still kept it at that name. And there's some output settings. Now probably easiest thing to do is to just click on this and find the preset custom output module of your own, or if you want to tweak everything, if you click right there where it says lossless, it brings up this dialog box. I can change the format, say H.264, go into format options, and there's all these different settings. Bring this down. I can resize it on export, or I can crop it on export, or whatever. Click OK. Or I can come in here and I already have an H.264 one set up as an output module. So say you like one, you set it up how you want, click OK, and it'll say custom. Then I come down here to make template, and it brings up this dialog box, and I can create a new custom template. So then if there's a certain way of exporting that you use all the time, just create it as a custom template, and then you don't have to do it every time. So that's that. I've got it. I want to export this as an H.264. Now where am I going to export it to? That's where this is right here. So I'm going to click right here where it says tree footage, where we find where we're going to save it to. Let's give it a name. So red square. Click save. And then now that it's there, I'm going to click render. It's going to render that out. That took really quick. And then I'm going to just bring in the footage so you can see what it looks like. And there it is. Completely rendered out. Just how we had it in After Effects. Thank you for watching and participating in this course. Feel free to comment and share this video with others. In our next video, we will cover pre-comps, parenting, pick whipping, and basic expressions. Again, this is Mikey Bort for PremiumBeat.com. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.